Hey, all, and welcome to the Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and chit chat about intriguing and sometimes controversial topics through the lens of skepticism. I am one of your hosts, Laura from Unapologetically Me, and I have with me today Richard from the Skeptic Takeout. Today, we are going to be discussing PTSD. So grab your English tea or your coffee, just coffee, and join us as we talk about actually a very serious topic that is near and dear to my heart: how trauma impacts people over time. This is episode 52, PTSD. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, PTSD, is a very serious subject. And so I want to offer out a warning because I want to be able to talk a little bit frankly about certain topics revolving around PTSD that could be triggering or difficult for people to listen to. So if this is the episode that you skip, no harm, no foul. It won't hurt my feelings. I doubt it'll hurt Richard's feelings. But if you're even a little bit worried and aren't sure what we're going to talk about, just skip this episode and don't worry about it. Just we'll be back next week with a new episode. But we are going to potentially get into some very serious subjects. So just a little trigger warning there before we get started. Oh, PTSD, serious topic. I
Yeah, definitely.
definitely, yeah, I really think this is when we need to start with what is PTSD. It stands for post traumatic stress disorder. Um, and there's a lot of like misinformation out there about it. So I really we do our episodes with no research. I was very, very, very tempted to research this one, but I stuck to my guns. We're gonna talk about it just ad lib. But I do want to I
We
do want to
we will not turn into Richard Gill and do
no,
secret research on the
the
side.
research will not be done, even though technically maybe it should be. Yeah, just because this is a more serious topic that there's a lot of misunderstanding or misinformation about out there. So the idea is for PTSD is that when you have a traumatic event happen, it actually changes your brain chemistry, and you get traumatized, and it can bring up issues or problems years later, and sometimes you don't even know that those issues or problems, or even just character traits like hypervigilance, for example, you might not even know that they're linked to this event that happened years ago, or events or things you were exposed to.
And I think it should be remembered that the kind of I was going to say trigger, but that's not the quite word. The things that cause PTSD to start with, the initial kind of things that set this into motion down the line,
Hmm.
can vary immensely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's come to light a lot in kind of post Gulf War,
Yeah,
uh,
for
with
military PTSD.
military people who've had it. But of course, it can come from childhood trauma. It can come from kind of abusive relationships, and all these things can all contribute to PTSD. There, there's I saw something. I don't know what it was. I think it might have been a You Are Not So Smart, that I saw an episode of, or I listened to an episode of, just as the pandemic was first kicking in. And at the beginning of 2020, like March, April 2020. And there was a suggestion on there from, I think it was a psychologist, but I don't remember the person's name, who was suggesting that it might be something to look out for as kind of COVID comes to an end, and like maybe a year after the thing has ended, we will see a rising number of PTSD cases because of COVID and the isolation and all the other things that have gone into it, the trauma and the stress that have gone into it. And that's something I'd be really interested in, see if that kind of prediction comes to light, to see if that is the case.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be really interesting because when you were talking and you were mentioning COVID, the first thing I thought of two things. The first one was how many people are gonna claim PTSD who don't actually have it, people who are inconvenienced or annoyed or
Yeah.
frustrated. And then I started thinking, that really takes away from the people who really seriously may have suffered, people who may have had access to certain things that were cut off from them, people who may have had access to a very limited amount of social interaction or people, and that got cut off. Like Richard said, isolated, and as soon as he said that word, I was like, "Good, he nailed it," right? Because, isolation is something that's very, very, very difficult for humans to deal with, and that does cause lasting emotional trauma. So, yeah, I'm glad that you gave it that qualifier, but I'm also concerned at the wave of additional claims from people who don't even understand what PTSD is that are gonna really muddy the waters as to what the actual impact was.
Yeah. And I think the thing is with when I listened to that episode of that show, that was the beginning of the pandemic. A couple of months in, I think it was. And this is now 3 years, 2, 3 years in. And that things have changed. We couldn't have predicted then what was happening. And
Right.
so much things have changed, and there've been deaths. I personally know uh, two people who've died from COVID related illnesses. One died from COVID directly. The other one had an underlying issue that COVID kind of uh,
Exacerbated. Mhm.
exasperated and caused the death to occur. Um, so yeah, it's really impactful, and I can still foresee that prediction coming true. But I'd love to see some figures. I'd love to see some studies on it, and just to see how much this has affected people and how far down the line it's going to continue affecting people, which is of course what we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, so when we talk about impacting people, one thing that I wanted to sort of get into, and I think this relates to COVID too, is that we tend to think in the public imagination, we tend to think of PTSD as being you get exposed to one really brutal or really horrible scenario or situation, or it could be several over time, like when we talk about military PTSD. But we tend to think of it as this one really bad thing happened. It was quick, it was temporary, it was over, and now you're scarred. And that's definitely one form of PTSD. But PTSD can also be any sort of trauma that happens, whether it's over a long period of time. I think, Richard, you mentioned it earlier, like child abuse throughout a childhood. It could be small things, it could be verbal abuse, it could be neglect,
Yeah.
right? And it happens over and over and over again, but then you start to develop these sort of um behavioral responses or emotional responses to things that aren't related to the original trauma, right? So maybe your parents, when they would punish you, they would slam the door really, really hard, right? And
Mm.
then 10, 15 years later, you have like, say the wind slams the door shut, right? And you just freak out. Your heart starts beating, you're sweating, you're having like sort of a panic attack. And that's only just one example. I really don't want to pigeonhole what PTSD is or what the
Yeah,
signs
yeah.
and symptoms are because they're varied. But that's just one example where that person, when they hear that door slam, they may not automatically put it together. They may not say like, "Oh, that freaked me out because when I was 5, this thing used to happen to
Yeah,
me."
yeah, yeah.
They might just be like, I don't know, I overreacted." But then when it happens again and again, or if it starts to impact like relationships or your ability to do your job, now it starts to become something that's impacting your life.
Yeah,
And
and that's why therapy is so important in kind of dealing with this stuff, so that they can kind of tease apart what is the cause of that, and address that and help to try and help. Even it's not it's not the case that they can always cure these things, but giving people kind of coping mechanisms to deal with them when they occur, and to connect the dots so that they can cope when these things happen. Very, very important.
yeah. Yeah, I would even go so far as to say, and this is gonna be maybe a little bit harsh, but I'm really I see a lot of us, especially with social media and Google, and we have a lot of information at our fingertips. There's a lot of self-diagnosing that goes on a lot today, not just with
Yeah.
mental health issues, but even with like physical ailments, right? And, that could be dangerous. It could be good to get a start, like, "Ooh, I have these symptoms. Google says it could be this. I should get my ass to a doctor." Right? Like, that's great. "Oh, bee stings, you can remove the sting or the swelling by doing this. Awesome, I can just do that." Right? So a good, there's a good bit that can come out of doing research yourself, but I would say in regards to what you were saying, be careful saying you have PTSD or and this is where I warned before the show, it might get kind of public service announcement-y on my part because I'm really passionate about this. If you think you have it, Richard's right. Get help, right? Get the diagnosis, go to a doctor, get the help because it is a serious condition. So if you just have like stress in your life and you're like, "Oh, I think I have PTSD," maybe don't label it as that until you know for sure. Maybe call it what it is,
Yeah.
stress, anxiety, anger, whatever the case may be. But if you really think you have it, I highly encourage people to go, because I know I've heard this is where we get into the skepticism part of it, right? I've heard people say, "Well, PTSD doesn't exist," right? It's just people need to learn how to deal with their issues or whatever. Um, but really that's exactly what it is we are not raised or taught for how to deal with certain issues. We don't have the mental
Yeah.
capacity to deal with certain traumas or certain issues. And the whole you just need to learn how to deal with it. Well, that's the medical part. That's the diagnosis part. And that's the get the help part, right? Um, so yeah, I didn't mean to get too much up on my high horse, but when you were
No,
saying like
no.
get help, I'm like, yes, absolutely. Don't say you
And
have something unless you've been diagnosed as having that thing.
And on that point, very often with PTSD, as I understand it, because I don't have it, I don't particularly know anyone who's I know a couple of people who've suffered from it, but nothing to that I've been personally impacted by. Um, from what I understand about it, the symptoms of it aren't necessarily indicators that you have it. The things like, as Laura said, it could be anxiety, it could be stress, it could be
Yeah.
things like this that aren't necessarily indicators that you have it, but are at the same time symptoms of it. So it's
Mhm.
very important that you go and kind of speak to a professional and get their advice and their help, because as with any kind of mental health kind of condition, it can be very dangerous if you start to make the diagnosis yourself and give yourself that diagnosis and look for the care and try self-care, and that self-care turns out to be wrong. That you do not want to go down that route.
Yeah, and there is also something to be said about negative reinforcement, right? Like, I mean, I've experienced this personally in my life. Oh, speaking of like things I've experienced in my life, I do want at some point I want it to be closer to the end of the episode. That way, people who don't want to listen don't have to. But I do want to share one of my own experiences with PTSD because you do know one person who has it, and it was pretty severe. But in my own experience, there has been times where if I thought that I may have had something or thought that I like to say, like, I'm pretty sure I'm neurodivergent, right? Like, my brain just doesn't seem to quite operate the same as people on average, but I don't have a diagnosis. I don't know if I have anything or that I have anything, right? But I would tend to do that. I'd read an article about, ADHD and, like, holy shit, that speaks exactly to me, right? I must have that, and then I'd read an article about high functioning autism. Holy shit, that speaks even more to me. Maybe I'm autistic. Oh my god, there's this article with links to ADHD and autism. I must have both, or whatever the case may be. Truth be told, I'm not diagnosed with either, and I'm seeking answers now through my doctor
Yeah.
and looking for a clinical psychologist. But until I have those answers, I can't. I could be just a perfectly functioning human being with no quote unquote neurodiversity, even though I believe we're all on a spectrum. We're all a little bit different here and there.
Yeah.
But I could fall within what the medical community would see as not needing any sort of intervention, right? Just a normally functioning brain, but I just need the tools and the language to figure out those little quirks that bother me. Or I
Yeah, and
might be
we've
on a
talked.
spectrum where I need help, right?
Yeah, we've talked about the importance of diagnosis before, and a quick shout out here to international freethinkers. We are
Oh, yeah.
parents. Me and
Yeah.
Laura both host a show about parenting and children in the secular community. Uh, Shout out to Justin and Jenna, who are both absolutely brilliant. We talked about the last show we were on. That's exactly what we were talking about: the importance of getting correct diagnosis, and sometimes the difficulty of getting a correct diagnosis. We need to kind of to push sometimes, and if we think, even if we're not sure, like we've just said, it's not always clear what the problem might be. If you suspect that you're having difficulty and that you're not coping right, go and get that diagnosis. And if you're pushed back, push against them and make sure that you get the help that you need as best you can.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I know that this kind of wanders more away from discussing what PTSD is or what we think about it, whether or not we think it's true or not. I think we've pretty much established that we both think of it as a very valid medical diagnosis.
Yeah,
Um, but I think it is really important to discuss how it impacts people and how people's ways of approaching this kind of stuff. Like, I'll tell you, people who have had traumas happen in their lives who haven't really explored it or haven't gotten any sort of diagnosis, they might have things where they're like, "Well, I'm just hyper vigilant," or "I just freak out when I see this or hear that." And or it could be very vague, like, "I don't know why, but I just struggle with relationships."
yeah,
Right? Or every time I get to a certain point in a relationship, something goes wrong or I back out or whatever. It could be so complex, but there could be something that they haven't really explored. And so knowing that trauma in general can condition our minds to react in a certain way, like even just taking away the diagnosis of PTSD and not calling it post traumatic stress disorder, just talking about trauma. When your body is subjected to trauma, it changes, like, your brain chemistry changes, and you don't always know what those repercussions will be because they're not always straightforward. Um, so I know we're coming up on a commercial break, but yeah, that's one thing that I think is really important to understand is that trauma can be really subtle and the results of trauma might not line up with what you think it would be, right? Like you might think the results of being abused as a child is being an abusive parent. And that is one potential outcome, right? But it could be a whole slew of different things like just an overwhelming desire to not even have kids but not really know why or whatever. It could be any number of things and exploring that might just at least help an individual to better understand who they are or where their motivations come from, right?
yeah,
Versus just, "Oh, well, it's part of who I am and I can't change," you know?
yeah. And with that, we'll go to the commercial break, and we'll come back to it after the commercials. So, what have we got uh, to offer you? Um, we have got, I think, first and foremost, it's very important to mention the Facebook discussion group. That is a place where we have a community,
Mhm.
and we welcome people into that community. To You can talk about the show, you can just talk about ideas you have, what you know in general. If you're struggling, there are people there who will offer you a community,
Mhm.
and that I think is very important, especially considering the nature of our current episode. And
Yeah.
we are there, and we are accessible. We're not aloof. We're not big enough to be aloof. We're just a tiny little show.
I know. Yeah,
We're-
we
we're-
still have the ability to really interact personally one-on-one with a lot of the content on our either
yeah, and
YouTube comments or our Facebook page, yeah.
if people want to address any of us individually, we're accessible. Go on that. I'm sure Gil would agree. There is nothing we like more than interacting with our audience. It's what drives us. Um, Another thing that drives us is having the ability to keep this show going. I got told off last week for doing an infomercial. I'm not going to do that this week. We have a merch store. You can buy loads of cool stuff like Laura's favorite, the
The
mouse
mouse
mat.
pad.
you can buy t-shirts with various logos on and slogans. You can buy we are literally, we have the widest range of merchandise, cushions, those. I don't even know what we have in there. There's that much, probably carb on it. So, oh, teapots and spaceship advertisements and
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Go on there and have a look, and you'll find something that
Right,
interests you.
what's cool is that you can actually pick the logo or the slogan or whatever that you like, and then go pick what kind of merchandise you want it to be on. So
Yeah,
that's kinda I love the flexibility of these online shops these days, and there's so many of them out there, but I love it where you can just like, "I want this logo on this kinda mug, and I'm right as rain." Right? So
yeah.
yeah, there's lots of options.
But that's a great way to support the show, and it gives us the opportunity to grow and bring a better product to you at the end of the day. If you don't want to spend money, and you can't spend money, you're not in that situation, that's fine too. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. We've got lots of platforms. If you go onto our Linktree page, it'll give you all the platforms we're on. And if you listen to us on one of those platforms, like it, share it, if you're on YouTube, give us a subscribe, get that viewership up, and that helps us too.
Yeah, thank you for your listenership. We're gonna head back now from commercial break. Okay, so welcome back from commercials. I kind of wanted to get a little bit more serious. And it's up to you, Richard, where you want to take this. But I kind of want to take an opportunity to share my experience with PTSD. But I wanted to kind of put it towards the end so that people could listen to as much as they wanted to listen to, and then choose not to listen to any stories if they don't want to. So
Yeah.
was there anything else that you wanted to say on the subject of PTSD, or what would you like?
I do you have an insight onto the history of it, because that would be quite interesting, I think, for our listeners. Would you consider, this is a question though, I know I've just asked you a question and I've jumped
And now
in
you're
with
gonna ask me
another
another
question.
question. Thanks a lot for that.
Would you consider, and this is something that struck me during the first half of the show, would you consider shell shock to be a form of PTSD?
I have no idea. Like, oh my gosh, I know way not enough about it to tell you where the line is between the two of them. I know it's isn't it a form of like from what I understand, shell shock is a form of oh, what do you call that? Not stress. It's a form of shock. It's right there in the name of it, shell shock. When your body goes into shock, right? And
Yeah.
that's when you're so overwhelmed that like things start to shut down, whether it's your brain's ability to process information or sometimes it's organs that will shut down. You'll start shivering, you'll get cold, that kind of thing. Shock is a very real psychological and physiological response to something. Um, but from my understanding, it's in the moment. And so I really don't want to mislead anybody about the differences
Yeah.
between shock and PTSD and shell shock specifically. But I do know that shock in general tends to happen while you're facing something or dealing with something.
Right.
And PTSD, it tends to be more long term, and it tends to be something that can manifest years and years and years later. Um, so yeah, that'd be interesting to find out what the because I don't know if something happens the next day or the next week in response to
Yeah.
something that happened, is that considered shock because it's still so fresh, or is that now considered trauma or just processing? Like I don't know how the medical community really delineates
No,
those
no, neither do I.
those things. Yeah.
It's interesting. It was just something that struck me during the first half of the show, because that was
Yeah.
immediately. I think it was when I was talking about the Gulf War and the post traumatic stress disorder Gulf, which
Yeah.
was called Gulf War syndrome at the time,
The
or was
time.
given the name. And that's really interesting, because that was a thing that was denied for a
Yes.
long time.
Yeah, that it didn't really
That
exist.
was a
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
The soldiers who were coming back and reporting that were kind of getting dismissed out of hand to begin with,
Yeah.
until the numbers really started making people sit up and say, "Hang on, there might be something going on here."
Yeah, I think there came a point where it was kind of undeniable. But yeah, my understanding of PTSD, and again, this is a very elementary level understanding. Like I really don't know the history off the top of my head. I know I've learned about it. I don't remember. I think I've learned about it a couple different times though. Like I think I've learned about it in a college course and also just my time in the military learning about it. I do believe that it started out as a military diagnosis and people didn't really put together that there could be other forms of PTSD until later. Now it's pretty widely accepted though that PTSD could be any form of trauma, and it may have even been accepted on small levels or at the medical level back then, I don't know. But certainly when PTSD first became a thing, somebody who is say like in a really bad situation as a child or who was raped or who is in a really graphic car accident, I don't think they would have necessarily labeled the trauma that they suffered as PTSD until later. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know the exact history of it because it did come out of that sort of Gulf War era and the Gulf War syndrome that they were experiencing. But me being me and seeing things as being more of a web and not a straight line, right? There was already brutal, bad, terrible, horrible wars. People were hacked to pieces. People were subjected to and exposed to all sorts of forms of violence and trauma. throughout human history. And
Yeah.
so I gotta wonder like what was so different about this one. And I'm sure that there's answers out there. I just don't know. But what was so different about the Gulf War specifically that um it caught people's attention, right? Because you had to assume that even during wars hundreds or even thousands of years ago, people would come home scarred, right? Not physically scarred, but emotionally and mentally scarred. So
Do you think it might be and I have no answer to this. This is very rhetorical. Do you think it might be uh, the case that kind of we've just become more sensitive to these things and open to saying, there is a problem.
mhm.
And just going totally off topic for a minute, I remember back when I was like in the early 80s, when I was a child and kind of when men were men and,
Men,
you know,
not
drove
emotional.
pickup trucks and didn't
Yeah.
wash them, and the, the the kind of that attitude where you didn't admit and you couldn't admit that something done, and thankfully, thank fuck that is changing, and you know, the, from kind of my generation possibly onwards, that's changing and people are more open. That
Mhm.
not 100%, but people are getting that way, and certainly with my niece who's in like 20s, early 20s, you get to that age group, and they seemed a lot more switched on with being able to talk about the feelings and admit when things aren't right. And
Yeah.
whereas we're still a bit stubborn, my generation, and we're like, no wrong with me, I'm fine. What I mean? All
Yeah.
manly and alpha and all that shit.
Yeah, you're you're
But
you're you're right. It
yeah,
is it is a sliding scale that's generational, right? Like, I had a friend who was talking the other day about his father and how stuck he is in his generational thinking of we don't talk about our emotions, we don't talk about our sexuality, we don't
yeah,
question things, and he was kind of commenting on how it impacted his father, and it was really impactful to me to think how many generations have people just been conditioned out of thinking that there's any relevance to whatever it is they're experiencing, right? Like, "Oh, I'm experiencing this thing, but it's just not relevant, or it's just me not being able to handle it, and I need to get over it. I need to toughen up." It kinda makes me think as like you said, I'm very interested in anthropology and the development of people over time. Um, I honestly think that there's nothing wrong with the fact that historically we were just taught to toughen up because historically we had to toughen up to survive. If early humans were like, "I need to put my emotions first, and I need to have a little breakdown now, and I can't function," very possible death, right?
yeah.
Very possible lack of survival. So there was a lot of roughness and toughness and grit that needed to go into just survival. And as we've developed more cushy ways of living and things have become more convenient for us, it's a defense mechanism. It's a natural survival mechanism that we're needing less and less and less of. Now it's just
That
starting
that
to hurt us.
That's really interesting to me because as you know, I'm interested in psychology and how the brain functions and all
Mhm.
that neurological stuff, which sounds about as intelligent as.
All that neurological stuff.
But and those areas, neurology and psychology, are really starting to kind of come into a phase now where we're beginning, and it is a beginning, but we are beginning to understand processes of the brain and how it relates to the world. What you've just said really interests me because what you've just said is that there has been a physiological aspect to that as well over time. And that is really, really interesting to me. And that's something I would love. This is not the time or the place to do it, but that is something I would love to expand on further in my own studies and have a
Yeah.
look more at how that physiological effect has changed over time and how that has affected us as people. That I
Yeah.
love that you've brought that up.
And that is by no means even remotely saying that we couldn't have gotten to this place a little bit sooner. And I still don't even think we're there yet in terms of acknowledging trauma and what it does to the brain.
Yeah.
We are just starting to figure it out. And we're I mean, if you think about it, studies of the brain where you're talking about behaviors and chemicals and stuff like that, at most decades old. Like, we don't have thousands of
Yeah.
years of history of, like, the psychological impact of trauma to people. We just don't. So it's
No,
difficult to know.
I
But
think
that's
infancy is a very good word to use when we're talking about
absolutely any
any
sort of
kind of
brain science.
neurological. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm not saying that we couldn't have potentially been a little bit more sensitive to people a little bit earlier in our human history, but it also just makes sense to me, like, one thing, progress can be slow, like, it could be hard to make changes that are drastic like that, but then the other thing is, like, it's almost like things need a revolution, things need to happen in big and I think the Gulf War is a good example of that, like, whatever happened to it's like, "Okay, now during this war, we are noticing there's enough of a problem that we need to start paying attention." Um, that was sort of a turning point, and so it just is what it is in terms of human history. But, but I don't doubt for 1 minute that PTSD is something, A, that we've experienced throughout our human history, and we've dealt with it in various ways, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's something that we start to acknowledge in the animal kingdom, right? Like you talk about, oh, I adopted this dog and I don't really know its history. I don't know, they found it as a stray, but I do know that it shakes every time the door knocks, or it barks whenever a car goes by, or it's afraid of men, or whatever. Like I have a little she's an Italian greyhound with some chihuahua in her, and she is really intimidated by gruff, big voices, right? Like commanding voices. And so I have family members, they come in like, "Hey, we're here." And she just goes bananas, right?
yeah,
I don't know that there's got to be some sort of trigger going on in her body where that means something to her. So I wouldn't be
yeah.
surprised if we find that it's not just a human thing.
Neither would I. It seems perfect. I've grown up around mostly dogs, but animals all my life, and there is no hesitation in me to say that they are immensely complex emotional creatures.
Mhm.
It's not just a case of there are humans and then there is the rest of the animal kingdom. We are part of that kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And in our
Uh,
psychology, while we have language and we have complex ways of dealing with stuff and thinking of stuff, our brains are not so different from the animal kingdom that we can say that well, we experience fear but they don't. We experience trauma but they don't. Like there's pretty clear indications that they do. So,
yeah,
yeah, that'd be interesting to find out. Um
yeah. We are coming up towards the end of the show. As Laura said earlier, we are going to go into some kind of deep personal uh, traumatic areas now. So if you want to turn off, please feel free to, and we will catch you next week. We do appreciate you listening.
Absolutely. With our love and with
It,
our support. All right, I'm going to let us pause for a moment. Anyone who wants to shut it off can shut it off. But the reason I want to share it is because we're talking about like what's the difference between like just PTSD and just being stressed out about something. Or what does it mean when you say I'm triggered, right? Because you hear that so often. My kids started saying that where they're like, "Oh, so and so's triggering me right now." I'm like, no, they're not. They're pissing you off, right? But that's a medical term that we've now kind of like taken and ran with. And PTSD triggers are more specific, and the reactions are more specific. So, I thought that by sharing my story, it might help give a little bit of understanding as to, what it really looks like and what it really means to have trauma that can hurt years and years later, and what, like, triggers can look like, and what that means when you say, "I'm triggered." So when I was 16 years old, my very first job, I was super thrilled about it and like I loved it and I was doing good. But I was sexually assaulted by the owner, by my boss. And it took place over a few months, and it was something that happened slowly over time and kind of kept escalating and escalating, and he kept trying to push further and further. And so it eventually got to the point where I was so intimidated and so scared and so like this isn't right that I finally decided to do something about it, and I pressed charges. And I'm not going to go to the level of extent of what all he did, but I didn't think I was traumatized. My parents got me into therapy immediately afterwards, and I thought that I was good. Um and I wouldn't talk about it except in the rarest of situations with very close family members, or if I'd been with a partner long enough that I kind of felt like they needed to know. Otherwise, I was very hush hush about it. Um, then in my 30s, right afterwards, immediately afterwards, there were little triggers, right? Not immediately like that next week, but in the years following. So a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, things would happen. There would be certain sexual acts that when someone tried to initiate them, I would shut down and start shaking. And I was like, what I would tell them is, oh, I just don't like that. We're just gonna do something different, right? Um, but that is an example of a trigger, right? So now you're taking an event that has nothing to do with the original event. It's not the original person, but something lined up enough, something was similar enough that it caused a physiological reaction. Like I would shake, and usually for a few hours afterwards. Um, I went to watch the movie American Beauty when it first came out in theaters, and that triggered me. And I had to walk out. I walked out. I think I might have made it about halfway through, maybe 3/4 through. I'm not even sure. But I was livid. I was shaking. I was crying. I was angry. I was like, "What? How dare you make a movie about a guy who's fantasizing about having sex with a teenage girl? Like, how dare you?" Right? It's disgusting. It's vile. It's horrible. Now, this is a traumatized teenage girl saying these things, right? I can now, as an adult, I can appreciate the theme and the message of that movie and how powerful it can be. Um, and that it also has other themes kind of worked in with it. But at the time, um, my physiological mental response was disproportionate to the situation, right? An average person would go to the movie, like it, hate it, whatever. They wouldn't have a really strong reaction to it. Mine was both emotional and physical. Like I was ill. I was shaking. Um, and then, that happened on and off for a few years. It took me a long time to sort of warm up to certain sexual activities again or certain ideas again. And I eventually did, but something interesting happened, and this is where PTSD can be really tricky. Again, I thought I was over it with the therapy. I'd have these little episodes, these little quirks. Thought I was over it years later. In my like 33, 34 years, at 33, 34 years old, something really weird happened. Like I went through this really bad episode, or period with my husband where like I was having issues. I was having emotional issues. I was having issues with intimacy. Like we were having problems and I couldn't figure it out. I was like, Mom, I was talking to my mom, Mom, there's nothing wrong between the two of us. Like nothing substantial has happened. Like I just don't get it. And she sat me down and she said, your therapist told me something years ago. She said, if you haven't dealt with your trauma, she's going to start having problems around her mid 30s. It is textbook for people who have sexual assaults or rapes or harassment at a young age, and it the timing lined up just perfectly, and that was when I finally realized I have traumatic stress around this event. Like it is lasting. It is impacting my relationships. It is impacting my experience. It's not just Laura's broken. It's not just this is how Laura is. This is something happened to her and her brain didn't process it at the time. So it took me till, and I'm only 39 now. So the recovery from this, it may not be permanent. Like I may find 10 years from now, I experience another trigger or something like that and not see it coming. But now I can talk about it. I did become a victim's advocate for a while to help other women. And that was really empowering. Um, and it helped me to find my strength and to offer that to other people. But healing for real, like acknowledging that I had trauma in dealing with it did not happen until my mid 30s. Um, and that was just because of a lack of an understanding of what PTSD was and a little bit of arrogance that, oh, well, I did therapy. Like I'm fine. I'm good. I just really wanted to share that experience. I know I rambled all the way through it, did not give Richard a
No,
single
that's
chance
good.
to interject, which I will do now. And
I would not have taken a chance to interject. Um, Thank you for sharing that, because it's in certain situations people can be sat thinking they've got no one and thinking they're the only person who's been through it,
yeah,
and hearing somebody else, especially if it's somebody you look up to, especially if you're listening to a show and and you listen and you get familiar with these people,
Mhm.
and you hear that coming from one of those people that you look up to. That can be empowering in and of itself. That might change somebody's life. And that is why there was no need for me to interrupt, because that was your space to talk and share your story, and give the opportunity for somebody who might need that help to listen and to just sit and digest it. And I want to say thank you to Laura for doing that, because that's important to let other people know that.
Yeah, of course. Like I said, it used to be really hard to talk about. I mean, it's still a little bit hard. I get a little bit, like, sick to my stomach talking about it, more because it's just not something that's, like, everyday language for me.
Yeah.
But it's really empowering and it's good. There's kinda 2 reasons why I like to share my story now. First is just so that people have an understanding of what it is that another person might be going through, right? Like, there's a lot of rape shaming and sexual harassment shaming where it's like the girl is supposed to get over it, or what was she wearing?
Yeah.
I was wearing my work uniform, by the way, like jeans and a button-up collared shirt, right? And I was a frumpy little, like, geeky girl. Like, I wasn't a hot chick in high school, right? I was a little freckled girl that was on the chess and debate team, right?
That is a very important point. That is a very, very important point, because we get this kind of idea that it's kind of the attractive girls who are abused and chased down, and the classically attractive. I'm not saying you're not
Yeah, no,
attractive,
no, I
Laura.
know
That
exactly
came
what you're
out
saying. No,
completely
like
wrong.
the wears
And
makeup, blonde hair,
yeah,
wears high
yeah,
heels. There's
they're
like
the
this sort of
ones who are
stereotype.
targeted.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's not the case at all. You know, anybody can be a victim of this. Anybody can be a
anybody.
victim of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and the second reason I wanna share is because it is amazing how many people who are out there that don't have voices, who either think that they're the only ones out there, and if one of those thousands and thousands and thousands or millions of people hears me or somebody else talking and it gives them hope or makes them feel not alone, then we should keep talking. Those of us who are strong enough or willing enough or have had that experience, to be able to, speak out about it, because it's very hard, and I would never shame someone who doesn't ever wanna talk about it. Um,
No.
I would encourage them to talk in a healthy way to maybe a professional or a trusted person, but if they said they never wanna talk about it, then I wouldn't take that away from them. But I do have the power and ability to tell my story, and I want, if anything, for people to know that, like, and it doesn't even have to be sexual assault, any form of trauma. You're not alone, just period. If you think that your trauma is bizarre or awkward or you're the only one or no, 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 mine's too weird. No, there's so many people out there with so many different experiences, even if they're not exactly like yours. They probably felt that same shame and embarrassment, thinking that they're alone, and the more people who share and the more people who speak up, the more that others get to know that they're not alone and that their feelings are valid, right? So for me, I felt like I was broken. I was like, clearly, I don't know how to have relationships because there's nothing wrong with this one. What the frack is going on, right? I felt like I was a problem, like I was not capable of having relationships. Knowing that there's other people going through these exact experiences, doing some more healing and some more therapy and learning some more about PTSD in general and about recovery specifically from sexual assault really, really helped me to not feel like I was in my own little cave. But I can get off that high horse now and pass it back to Richard.
Yeah, I think we are coming up to the end of the show. Uh, I just want to repeat thank you to Laura for saying that it's vitally important
Yeah.
that people share those experiences. This, we are a light-hearted, fun show, and this episode has been, it's been a difficult one. There is help out there. I think if I can leave you with anything, it's go. If you think, as we said earlier in the show, you might not know exactly what it is that you feels wrong with you. It might just be anxiety. It might be depression. It might not be PTSD at all. It might be something entirely different. But if you're feeling uncomfortable within yourself and you feel like you need help, go and seek it out. And very importantly, considering especially in Britain, the mental health services are really hard to access. And if you think you're not being listened to, push, because there is no harm in that whatsoever. You mental health. is as important as physical health. If you'd broken
if
your
not more
arm,
so. Yeah.
yeah, if you'd broken your arm, you're not just going to sit there and say, "Oh, it's all right. Everything's
It'll heal
absolutely fine.
itself. It's just a
It'll
flesh
heal
wound.
itself." You're not going to do that. Mental health is as important. So make sure that you take that advice, you seek out that help, and you push for it if it's not forthcoming, because you are important. You are important. And that is the most important message that I can put across.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love, thank you so much for this episode. It's probably been our heaviest episode we've done.
So yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I thought it was really good. And those of you out there listening, if you did make it through my story and you have any questions, I am not bashful about it. I am respectful about what I share and don't share, but not bashful. So if you do have any questions, as long as they're respectful and well intentioned, then yeah, go ahead and ask them. If you have general ideas, thoughts, concerns, stories, anything that you want to share about PTSD, I would ask if you're gonna put it on our Facebook page, just add a little trigger warning if it is something that other people experience as PTSD, just because, that is a real thing.
It's mental health across all aspects is very important to be open about and to discuss and feel comfortable with.
Absolutely, and I think we should end it on that. Thank you, audience, for listening, and we will see you guys next time.
See you later. Thank you.
Bye.